So thanks everyone for joining the panel. I think that the good news is the questions I think I'm going to be talking about today, there's clearly demand for, not only in the spreadsheet that we collected from the questionnaires, but also from the questions from your talks as well. So really, actually, this is kind of diving straight in from the last question. I'd like to understand from each of you guys, what KPIs are you using in software development outside of stability? We've already talked about stability. What other KPIs are important to your teams and to figure out when to build software versus fixing bugs, or more broadly than that? I'll start with you, Jane, because obviously we heard about your OKRs. Are there any other OKRs that relate to this?
No, honestly, for us, because we aren't a massive company, obviously. Every user is relatively important to us. So a lot of what we have is sort of the Venn diagram of like, how many people are we really affecting by things? How much of that is in recent versions of the application? Because we do have a very wide range of applications and older applications still running to date. So there are a lot of old headsets out there, and how frequently is it happening? So it's like that sort of like gets you to like the little nugget in the center, essentially, of what really is the most important. So that's how we sort of push it forward. And product is very aware that every customer really does count for us. So at this point, it's a really easy sale. So for me, it's not as hard as like, trying to pitch like the, 10,000 users out of 10 million in a day, So it's a much easier pitch.
I imagine that's going to be true of this question will be answered differently depending on the stage of company, yes. And also depending on job title as well, for sure. I know, Jordan, in your data role, there's probably lots and lots of KPIs or metrics that your teams look at. So it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about the other metrics that your teams care about.
Yeah, I think, crash rate is definitely one of the most well-behaved and well-known, and historically the one that we've had for the longest. And we have a lot around latency. And that's UI and time to music.
Time to music, that's interesting. So when I was talking earlier about time to first interaction, I think Square probably talk about things in terms of payments and transactions here and there. It really depends on the use case. That's super interesting. And PY, your team is the observability team. Is that true?
No.
No, excellent. You certainly care a lot about observability.
Yes, I do.
There. And so what constitutes observability at Square, if you're allowed to talk about it?
Oh, we're not quite in a place where we have a lot of that on the mobile side. We deal with payments, which means that from the very beginning, a lot of our metrics were server-based, based on basically payment volume and transactions, and we care about how long between, I swipe a card and the money's in my bank account, so these kind of things. Yeah. Then for everything else, for the mobile side, it's not so much like KPIs in terms of numbers, but we have all these stages, right, where we look at our test and at the flakiness of our UI test and unit test. We have all these we pay other companies to do manual testing. And this is very high priority because when something is found in manual testing, we can assume it's going to happen a lot. And then on the other hand of that loop, we have a strong customer support, and that we have an on-call rotation. Actually, Bugsnag is also super useful here because and you probably know that, you get a customer who's like, well, it doesn't work. Yeah. And the support sends you that, and you're like, okay. And then you start digging into what happened to the customer. So we have numbers around those things.
That's interesting. I'm in that process right now with Google Home. Suddenly my Google Home app stopped working, and I said, hey, it doesn't work because that's all I have. And hopefully they're using something behind the scenes to figure that out. Awesome. Once you've got these OKRs in place, I think the next question is, how do you figure out which bugs to fix first? Now, we've had a couple of questions around this from the audience, and I know that every team has a different process. So, I guess I'll start with you the first, Jordan, this time. It sounds like that your team is responsible for identifying and escalating, and then connecting the dots with the engineering managers. Is that accurate?
I think we have built out some of our own monitoring tools, but engineering leads and QE have their own suite of things that they're also monitoring. We also get, I'm sure you guys have had this too, where if an executive has a problem, then it's a problem for everybody. And I think that's fair at some level. Like, they are users, and so you have to respond to that. And we also are escalating a lot from our customer feedback, although it's not, as I said before, it's not ideally what we want to do. It's one of our best signals because we have a very active user support organization. We can link it back to listener IDs and then start to dive in that way. So I think that's some of the ways we prioritize are those signals.
Awesome, that's helpful.
Yeah.
And it sounds like actually there's a pattern emerging here. It sounds like all three of you are saying when a customer emails in and complains, in Within's case, every customer matters. Probably in payments and transactions, if a payment fails, you really want to get to the heart of that. And even in scale on a consumer mobile application like Pandora, that's an early signal. So expanding on that a little bit, Jane, how do you, I think this was touched on earlier, but how do you correlate between a customer request and a crash report?
How do you mean? And correlate between the two of them?
Yeah.
Oh, for us, that's easy. Because we use the data tab, and we actually have, our device IDs. We also have, user IDs, and we have all the information about their email and everything else. We put that in every single event. So there's no, for us, there's no error. We know this user is this event, and so it's very easy for us to filter by that. So.
Cool. Direct ID correlation.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Direct,
Is that the same true for your teams as well?
We actually limit the data we send to Bugsnag to only be crash data. We have our own, Pandora's been around for like 17, 18 years. So we built out our own, stats reporting engine. It's at this point, it's pretty sophisticated. So we feel comfortable sending our own stats for everything but crashes, basically.
Got it. Makes sense. Hopefully that means that we're the trusted crash partner then, and that was a layer that added on.
Yeah.
And same true for you, PY?
Yeah, I mean, we have this issue where a lot of the times, Square, you have this mobile device and you have this external payment device, and it also has code that's running, which this is more like firmware, and we actually don't use Bugsnag for that, but we send those logs through some other pipelines similarly, so there's this whole idea of joining all those data sources and combining them into what happened to a customer. But really, I think it's interesting, like we do everything that was just described earlier around like, okay, 2-week release cycle, we cut a branch, we test it. If we find anything, we fix it, then we release with a progressive rollout. We look at the stats, we fix the top crashes based on number of users more than number of crashes, right? And then that's all great, but if someone's emails in and, then I think, I don't have the details there, but I think we also look at how much money transactions are doing and all that. It really tips the scale on what to prioritize. Like, we have this process for releases, but then if there's something important and people email in, we usually take a look, and that maybe we'll prioritize something that would be further down the list.
Got it, that makes sense. Yeah. So the squeaky wheel gets the oil almost in that situation.
Yeah, don't say that too loud. But yeah.
Don't encourage people to do that, of course. But yeah,
no, I want to encourage people. You have a problem, we want to hear about it. I mean, it's a great signal. Yeah. So crash data tells us something, but the thing that I will say about crash data is that there's crash A, crash B, crash C. They're totally different flavors of crashes. I know on Android, and I don't know if this is true on iOS too, but you can have a crash and never know about it. It'll come right back and might not even interrupt your playback in some cases, whereas others hang, you can't get back yet, might have to even log out and log in. I mean, there's like a spectrum.
Yeah.
And so when we know that a very small percentage of our listeners are going to take the time and email us, so we treat that really, really seriously, because that means someone loves our app or likes it enough to send us a note and tell us that we effed up or whatever. Yeah. And so we're going to really take the time to investigate for those.
If I can add to that, it's actually really interesting. We use this foreground metadata piece to know, if a bug is happening if a crash is happening in background, Android is not going to display any dialogue. The user won't notice, like you said, and so we're less likely to prioritize that for sure.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay, so there are other metrics outside of is this customer more important than others that you guys may be unique to your use case that help you prioritize. Yeah, makes sense. Jane, it would be interesting to expand on every crash matters kind of concept. Does that mean that your customer support team are answering a lot of tickets right now?
There's no such thing as a customer support team within.
Okay.
Everyone is customer support at this point.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. Actually, we, especially in the engineering team, I mean, it's sort of like a hot potato. We take turns taking the shit work, which is essentially the crash work. So some sprints you're working on purely just solving a lot of really complex and odd bugs, and sometimes you get to do feature work. So we do make a point to actually try to knock down at least the top 10 to 20% of our crashes on a regular basis. So it's pretty easy for us to like continually evolve and get better and have better quality code as we go. So.
Awesome. I mean, that leads excellently into my next question for the panel, which is around accountability and ownership. In an environment where every engineer is looking at the bugs coming in, it probably helps build awareness around customer issues and touching multiple parts of the code base as well. The question I have for the panel here is, where does ownership and accountability lie for stability KPIs, and are there any tips you can share around team structure? And this has kind of been touched on a little bit already, and every company does something different here. So Jane's already mentioned that there's a rotation there, and everyone touches this, even on the support side, which is awesome. How about you guys?
We have a team we have a rotation both back end and client side. The client side we call bug busters. The back end we have sort of a 6-week quality rotation to tackle issues. And then on top of that we have we always think about outages from a server perspective, but we are starting to think about them from a client perspective, using a suite of sort of thresholds, or if you exceed that, we consider that to be serious enough that you've had a client outage. And it's never really like a server outage. Like a server outage, millions of people don't get your service for generally a pretty limited period of time, and you know about it immediately. A client outage is more like it could be 4 months, where you just have had a lot of complaints, you haven't gotten to the bottom of it. And so when that happens, we're now having a lot more structured review process and a lot more structured sort of ownership and blameless sort of process around that to try to get better and learn and not have them as much anymore.
That's super interesting. So taking learnings, even using the word outage, I think is almost magical and
it gets people's attention.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and so presumably then you'll take similar steps like postmortems.
Yep.
And writing up reports. Is that true on the client
side?
Right.
And then so what happens is that in terms of ownership is that you've got an engineer who's committed something that was bad and it got past the PR reviewers, 2 of them, and the release manager reviewers, and the question is, how could that happen? And it got past QE. And it's sort of like, so then you get to sit down and have the person who wrote the bad code tell you why that happened, but it's all blameless, so we just say, this thing happened. And then we get to talk about process and sort of see where our gaps are.
That makes sense. So us against the problem rather than us against them.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's interesting. Is that true at Square as well, PY?
Not quite. One of the interesting, so we have a problem that some of the larger companies have, which is that we have a little bit too many engineers contributing to the same code base. And so the way, we started small application, a few engineers, and then we started creating feature teams to accelerate, but they're all contributing to the same app, so it's the same process running. And then we started creating variants of our app. There's Square for retail, Square for restaurants, this kind of thing. But they're all kind of based on the same code base with some features and some variants and that. And so the problem we got is it all goes into one pipeline, Bugsnag. And so then who do you own responsible and how do you dispatch, right? So we have a release manager. And the release team is really an ops team, and we've kind of automated the cutting a branch, really progressive rollout and all of that. And but at the end of the day, they are the ones who are looking at the top 10 crashes and trying to figure out which team those belong to. And that's actually tricky because it's not one project per team, it's all of the teams are in the same project. So how do you figure that out? And it's more of an iterative process, the way we're basically spending time with the ops, teaching them how engineers try to find the code. So the kind of the default mode when they don't know what to do is they'll assign to an engineer who'll be like, nope, that's not me, that's actually that other team. So you kind of like jump around. But then progressively, we're teaching them like, look, here, you can see the package. It says appointments. That's probably something for that team. And so we're trying to iterate on as we go and build knowledge in the ops team.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
You're looking for heuristics that point towards which team should.
I would love to have Bugsnag tell me this is that person or that team, but I think we're not quite there
that
yet.
may be in the roadmap. One of the interesting things that I find is around what Jordan said is the blameless culture. We've been asked a couple of times by customers if we can say who touched this code last. Whose fault is this? And even in Git blame is a very loaded term. And sometimes there's that engineer that's just done a refactor from changing tabs to spaces, or see, you can tell I've been in the industry for a while. But that's not necessarily the person that caused the problem. What's the adage? Cunningham's law of the best way to find the right answer on the internet is to say the wrong answer. That sounds like you were talking about a little bit there. It was like, hey, here's an engineer. And they're like, no, that wasn't me. It was this guy. But I think that's going to be an interesting thing, figuring out how to get accountability and ownership without having finger pointing.
Well, what we find a lot is that engineers actually are more than happy to say, oh, that was me, I did that.
Yeah.
And actually, it's not helpful because, I mean, it's great. I mean, it's great that you're willing to take ownership. But really what we see is when you say that, it's not your fault. It's that we have a process that's broken, and you're a part of it, and the process can be improved. And so by taking ownership, you're taking your eyes off of the larger problem at some level. So I think from an ownership perspective, it's good to have that sort of, there is a problem, it's not me perspective.
That's awesome.
It made me think really one of the best way we so exactly like you said, there's the process of like the after, like, okay, where did we miss in the QA pipeline and all of that. But one of the, like the way that our best engineers investigate crashes is, of course, you look at the stack trace, you get the context, you understand, okay, we forgot to do this thing here. Hopefully it's never like, oh, null pointer exception, if not, no, I'm done, right? It's more like, what's going on? But where it gets more interesting is effectively diving into Git, not to know who made the change or who caused the bug, but the series of events that led to that bug. Like when was it introduced? Probably the person had some assumptions about this, and maybe actually when they contributed the code, everything was working fine, and then something else happened. And so when you kind of rebuild that story, you can figure out maybe we need more classes, maybe we need more QA, maybe something else. So this frameworks is leading us to have more bugs, maybe.
That's interesting.
Pattern or something.
Presumably then you can then introduce more process changes. For example, if you're touching shared libraries that multiple teams are using, there's this extra step in the process, or at least validate that all of the places this library is used it still works the way you would expect it to be.
It's interesting that you have this two reviewer process where we have the strong opinion that it should be one. Actually, it should be zero. Kidding. But in the sense that we expect that it's the engineer responsibility to find as many reviewers as they think is necessary. And if I do a one-line change and it's a comment that I'm changing, I don't need two reviewers. Maybe I need one. If I'm updating the README, really, do I need that many reviewers? That kind of stuff. And so it's hard to create that culture where engineers feel responsibility and like, they're not just ask their buddy to review. Can you just approve that PR, But it's more like, oh, this is a part that I don't know about. I'm going to ask someone else to review it, and that kind of stuff.
That's good. That's interesting to hear. And I think that we talked about this earlier. There's not just the tech side of things. The people in the process is very important here. And is that true within as well, Jane? How does the review process work?
So the review process is anything that is relatively simple is trivial. It's no need for review essentially, but anything that is either large, potentially either critical systems that are going to be touching multiple things, because we do also have core libraries and core utilities, they should be reviewed, and at least by one person, if not multiple. Part of the reason also that we use reviews ultimately isn't to find bugs, because that's really not what they do. Part of it is actually sharing the knowledge of understanding how all of the systems are working together, because then you have a bigger picture of the entire project and not just your little tiny piece of the world.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's I guess you get that from the everyone being a customer support tech as well, everyone reviewing. It's rather than siloing on one part, you get to understand the real customer experience.
Yep. Yes.
That's good to hear. Okay, switching gears a little bit. I know obviously all of you are Bugsnag customers, but before Bugsnag, how did you solve these kind of problems? So I guess I'll start with you, PY, and work this way this time.
Okay. So I mean, I've been at Square for like 6 or 7 years. Before that, I did some Android in plenty of places. There was a library called Acra a while ago. There was some other things. I remember, it's just kind of a side story, but I joined a startup who had just raised funds, and they went from 1 to like 7 engineers, and 5 of those spent all of the engineering effort building a backend for logs and crashes and stuff. And then I arrived, and I was like, why are we doing this?
What product are we building?
Yeah, exactly. So at Square, we started with Crashlytics, and it was decently good. I shouldn't, okay. At the time,
just open up.
My reaction was, why is there a giant stamp coming down when I check mark it as fixed? Why do I have 40% of the screen estate is about the battery, the battery state when the crash happened, which I'm like, I don't care. More importantly, we had a couple issues. We didn't really trust the client-side code. We had issues with that. They did one thing once, it probably happened only once, but they removed a dependency on Maven. So all of a sudden, all of our builds were broken. That was a while ago, but still, that kind of pissed us quite a bit. And then I think, actually, when we started using Bugsnag, I have no idea how. I think someone knew you or something like that, because it was like, we're starting to get the hang of Crashlytics, and then someone's like, oh, we're going to use Bugsnag. And I was like, what? No, we just finally got to something stable. And I've never heard of this company. Why do you want to use them? And they're like a small company, and they could die any day. And so, yeah.
I remember, this is true story. I remember being in an early meeting when you were in it, and I was like, this is the guy I've got to convince in the room. Because the some other teams at Square were already using Bugsnag. And I definitely got the cynicism at that time, so I'm glad we won you over in the end. Same question for you, Jordan.
I've only been at Pandora a little under 2 years, so I'm really glad that Dave came to keep me honest. I have no idea I was there when I got there.
Okay.
So.
And Jane, you've kind of talked about this a little bit already. I guess within was Bugsnag from day one.
For sure. So at the current company, for certain. I mean, I'm a little. I've been in this long enough now that I've actually worked with things like Flurry for crash reporting, which is horrendous. No filtering. Criticism actually was what we used before Bugsnag, and it was a little bit before and a little bit after, because depending on what history you're looking at, because it was a studio by itself before it was acquired by Glue. And then also Crashlytics a little bit too. All of them are painful to use, mostly because of the filtering. I mean, that's the thing that actually sold me is being able to really drill down to things that we wanted to see, and also the grouping by context, which nobody else really offers well. I mean, criticism, essentially everything is its own unique event versus actually bundling things together appropriately. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. We hear that a lot on the filtering side of things. I mean, I talked about not all. You shouldn't fix every bug, and I think one of the hard things to do is figuring out, well, which ones should I fix then? And we talked about prioritization earlier. Every single person up on the stage here probably has completely different custom filters set up, depending on the way their business is run or the technology they're using. I know that in Unity land, maybe it will be which scene you're on, or which part of the experience has been loaded, or level, or something like that. You can show I'm an expert in game development and XR experiences here. Could you talk a little bit about some of the filters you've set up?
For us, yeah. Most of the filters are actually based on, not on that. They're more based on versions, because we're constantly releasing versions, and we're covering a lot of platforms. So I mean, even our 360 platform is covering, I think, 7 different products essentially across all the different headsets and all the different versions of headsets, and there's Chinese versions of the same headset. So we're covering a massive thing. So for us to be able to look at things, we're actually filtering them by what version it is, potentially some slices by obviously by operating system as well. That's huge for us. And most of it is essentially recency. So it's like, how much do we care about this? Did this happen in the last 6 months? No. Okay, we simply just don't have time, because it's clearly something that's died on the vine, and we don't have to worry about that today.
Yeah, makes sense. And so presumably, like hardware, which type of headset it is one of your filters
absolutely,
as well. Yeah. And imagine at Square it's similar. I imagine there's a lot of different types of payments devices that are distributed out into your customer base.
Yeah, we use filters a lot, but not yet. I guess we have different pipelines. We don't use Bugsnag to that full extent yet. This reminds me of there was a really interesting presentation from our hardware team inside Square, where they explained that they capture signals from Bugsnag, but because we're shipping an entire OS, they capture signals from a bunch of places. And they had an interesting problem, which was we have beta merchants. So this is about the hardware. So it's not just sending an app, it's actually giving them test hardware, that kind of stuff. And the problem was, is our set of this is like sensitive, secret, we don't give it to a lot of people. So is our set of beta merchants representative of our bigger sets of customers? And they actually fed they started identifying many attributes, fed all of that into a machine learning model. And they identified clusters, and that helped them understand, based on crash data, and that helped them understand, oh, right, we're missing someone that is like, I don't know, I'm making things up, but like a small business that's doing that kind of thing and this other kind of thing. All these attributes, this is a cluster that is not represented by a beta program. And so that helped them identify. That's something that I think maybe is coming down the line someday, but it'd be amazing to be able to magically identify clusters and all of that, right?
That's a bit further down the line, maybe. Yeah. I think that's really cool use case. I'd like to steal a copy of that presentation, but that's really interesting. And so clusters and things like that is so hard to get right on on an individual company basis even, and trying to get that right on a macro basis is such a hard problem I know some of my engineers in our UK office are itching to get at that problem though. Awesome. And then final question, if we have time for another question. So how does Bugsnag fit into the rest of your developer tooling ecosystem, right? This is not a standalone thing. I mentioned earlier that the left-hand side of the software delivery lifecycle we're not touching, but there's a lot of different parts to this. So I guess I'll start with you this time, Jordan. What other kind of parts of the stack do you have on software delivery?
I'm not. Well, I mean, our QE team has a bunch of automation software that they're using. And from the analytics end, we're looking at Anodot. So whenever we have new releases, we're seeing anomaly detection there, which is a little more sophisticated than just thresholds. And we have some internal dashboards that we look at. I think that's sort of the majority that I know about.
I guess you gave us a preview of your data pipeline earlier.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what happens. I think there's more to it in terms of the testing that happens after the features are developed, but for quality signals, we're primarily looking at some of our internal analytics signals and crashes. Like those are the big ones. So. Okay.
PY, what kind of parts of the dev lifecycle do you care about, and what tools do you use there?
I think we've kind of covered a lot of that already. I don't know that I have a lot to add. The one thing I want to say is, instead of talking about the other things we use rather than the Bugsnag, I kind of want to touch on how, I think someone touched on that in the audience, how we use Bugsnag for things that it's not meant to.
Okay, yeah.
And that's kind of my fault most of the time, but I have this nice hammer called Bugsnag and everything is a nail. And so we use it for like UI test reporting, where we basically plugged in Bugsnag as a test listener, so that failing UI test, they have a stack trace because an assertion just throws an exception. So you can group them, and so it's useful for flakiness because you get to know which test is failing in what way the most often. So you get that. And then the other way, which you know about, is with leak canary and leak detection. So it gives you what's called a shortest path to GC route, which is a complex term I'm not going to explain here. I also call that a leak trace. But it turns out it's very similar to a stack trace in concept. So turn that data into a fake stack trace, and we upload that to Bugsnag, and that helps us prioritize leaks in the very same way that you would prioritize crashes.
That's cool. So you flip my question around.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is you just need Bugsnag in the software delivery lifecycle.
It does everything.
Nothing else.
Yeah.
And then finally, Jane, how do you manage software delivery at your teams? Things like Jenkins and GitHub and things like that. What's in your stack?
All of those. Jenkins, GitHub. We also have, while we do use Bugsnag for most of the things, we do have some times where we have to look at things like the native crashes, because of course we work in Unity. So we use things like the Xcode crash logs and also the Android side of things periodically in the Play Store, because they have a little bit of reporting there. And Unity Analytics has its own little reporting. But primarily we use Mixpanel for anything outside of just general crash issues for analytics. And then we have Jenkins. We also use Bitrise, which is another build platform. But thankfully, there are people that, because it is relatively open source as well. It's like, build your own build pipeline, essentially. You can plug in other people's work, which does things like speaking out to integration for Bugsnag, which is really nice. So we can actually send our DSIMs over to there automatically for us. So, yeah.
Awesome. Glue the whole thing together.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Okay, so I think that's it for my questions. I really appreciate the panel's input here. I'm sure, hopefully you guys learned a lot there. I think we're going to throw it out to the floor for some questions, or
If there are any questions,
any follow-ups from our panel questions? Let's see, there we go.
The idea actually just popped up. Sometimes I want to file a bug for open source, and then I think about how much time it's going to take me to take it out of my code base and then share it. If you guys ever thought about doing something, I forget what the other company is, but they do for like security bugs where they do bounties. You ever like consider, for open source it seems like it'd be useful.
Yeah, so that's, I'm not sure if any other panelists have a input here, but sometimes we get asked for, hey, because Bugsnag's running in production, I've seen a crash that happened in a library that we've included. Is that kind of what you mean? Yeah. Yeah, so we've been asked for a special dashboard there. The interesting thing is separating out the customer sensitive information from the SDK specific information. And sometimes you end up stripping out so much data that the crash report's not actually useful anymore. And same is true for breadcrumbs. There might be user steps that identify the user in there, especially with an increased focus on privacy, GDPR, CCPA, all these kind of things. You need to be really careful about what you send back to SDK developers. But yeah, at PY you make a lot of open source libraries. How do you find out about bugs in there? Do you get any production reports coming in?
People send me screenshots. I hate it. Yeah. You know how it works. Like open source is very much like someone, GitHub is improving at providing you with templates, but people will either remove them or leave the entire template and write at the top. The whole thing is just a mess, and I think we're basically learning. So we're learning to teach people like, hey, so this is how you file a bug report and that kind of stuff. Thing. I want to mention, you probably know this, but one of your competitors, which I'm not going to name, had for a while was, I think, investigating a way to get more revenue by offering third-party SDKs, to pay for it and to, in exchange, get some data about their SDKs and whether they're crashing or not. But that never, actually happened. So I suspect they hit some walls and realized it was a little bit tricky. We built an SDK at Square once, so like a private SDK. I was on that team, and it was an SDK that had a ton of code, like not a small SDK, but a large SDK. It's the SDK to take payments. And so we needed to know what was going on inside the code. So what we did is we actually repackaged Bugsnag. So because it's on Android, it's an exception handler, you can actually compose those. So basically, we were part of those. We would, as part of our SDK was including Bugsnag, which means every crash that those customers' apps would get, we would get, and we would add our own metadata. Now, you know that the Bugsnag SDK does not quite support that because of some folder names that are constant, so we had to do a bunch of tricks there. But then the most tricky and interesting part was figuring out, is this bug ours or is it the customers? Because I don't care about a crash in their part of the app. So because we had activities, we had to do things like, was one of our activities there? Do we see our name in the package? This kind of stuff. And that wasn't perfect, but that was like good enough to help us drive the top crashes.
Cool. Yeah, in our mobile libraries, we can't crash. We're not allowed to crash. We're a crash detection library. But there are some edge cases, and PY mentioned a couple of these earlier, where we can't write a crash report to disk because we're out of disk space, for example. And so we actually report some heuristics back to Bugsnag from our own SDK deployed into other people's applications as well. It's a bit easier for us to figure out where the crashes are happening, and mostly they're handled exceptions that we're hooking into. But yeah, it's a tricky, like the company you said that you mentioned probably came to the same conclusion that we did a long time ago, which is this is a not an easy problem to solve. But yeah, good question. Any other questions for the panel?
So for those of you that are doing user segmentation, have you been able to use some of your crash data from Bugsnag to provide insights into, like deeper insights into engagement and retention?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly, it's not necessarily, we have a really robust product analytics team and data science team, and me. And so I sit outside of the rest of the sort of music genome data science team. But we look at, we certainly look at churn and retention across device, OS, app version, a whole suite of variables, like listener demographics, you name it. And then I think where we're going is, and we also have churn models that incorporate crash data. And so that tells us about their importance. But what we find is that from a prediction perspective, the greatest predictors of churn are engagement, not necessarily crashes. So even if you are crashing a lot, if you use the app a lot, you're probably not going to leave. Right. So, I mean, but I think, yes, to your question is we want to do more of that where we're using crash data along with a bunch of other quality signals to help understand churn. And one thing about when I thought about prioritization for this talk, we have engineering effort prioritization, but we also have marketing effort prioritization. And so we have used Bugsnag for marketing effort prioritization where we have a particularly bad crash. We'll say, sort of through appropriate channels, alert our marketing partners and say, you might want to reach out to these people. Tell them we're sorry about what happened. We know there was a problem. We fixed it. Please come back. We love you. Whatever you say to your people when you have a mistake.
Okay, thanks for the thoughtful questions, everyone. Hand back to Kirti.
Again, thank you to all the speakers. That was super insightful. Thank you to all of you for your participation and questions, thoughts, shared ideas. It was really a fantastic afternoon, at least for me. Hopefully everyone enjoyed it as much. Whether teams are discussing technical debt, whether you're figuring out which features to include in the next release, we find that stability is the binding agent. It's a metric that is bringing teams together. And we believe at Bugsnag that when you get united over metrics, that's when teams unite as well.